You're listening to the Archaeology Podcast Network.
This is the CRM Archaeology Podcast. It's the show where we pull back the veil of cultural resources management archaeology and discuss the issues that everyone is concerned about. Welcome to the podcast. Hello and welcome to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode number 163 for May 8th, 2019. I'm your host, Chris Webster. On today's show, we talk about how and why we determine eligibility in CRM archaeology and what that even means. So get out your high-level theory books because the CRM Archaeology Podcast starts right now. Welcome to the show, everyone. Joining me today is Bill in California.
Good morning.
Doug in Scotland.
Hey, guys.
Sonia in Utah.
Hello.
And Stephen in Calgary.
Hi.
And Bill Octor couldn't join us today because he's doing the right thing, not sitting in front of a computer recording a podcast, but seeing Avengers Endgame because we're recording this on the weekend it came out. So that's what we all should be doing. Anyway, we're here. We're recording the podcast. And I think, we had a couple different topics that we're going to go over today. We'll just see what we get to. But Sonia, one of the things you were mentioning in our Slack chat in the background was not irritating your boss. Not that anyone is irritating your boss, but you're a boss, you're an owner, you're a company owner. These things are probably always in the forefront of your mind, whether somebody's doing it or not. So we're not calling anybody out. Mm-hmm. But what makes you happy, Sonia? What makes you happy as a boss? I'm thinking Vanilla Sky right now. Like, what makes you happy? And right before
what makes me happy?
Yeah, right before she careens off the overpass into a thing.
Exactly. What makes me happy? What makes me happy is when people do their jobs correctly. They follow instruction.
Yeah.
And are responsive to change. And change is not easy. Trust me, I'm a little joyman girl, as they like to say. Change is difficult for me, but at risk of sounding almost like a hypocrite, change is inevitable, and therefore we need to be able to accommodate different types of changes to methodologies in the field, even between projects.
This is archaeology. Let's unpack that a little bit because not a lot changes from project to project, to be honest, unless the client has specific requirements. But how we record stuff and things like that, the state doesn't really change their requirements as often as we'd probably like them to. So what kind of change are you really referring to?
Well, my crews jump from state to state, so therefore our methodologies do change quite significantly in some areas. When my crews jump from a project in, Mississippi all the way up to Idaho, it's a huge adaptation. And fortunately, most of my crews have experience in different regions, which is not unusual, but it's helpful. Keeps them marketable, which is great. But the difficulty falls in if I go out and I say, okay, this site is eligible for reasons A and B.
Yeah.
And we are recording this site as an eligible archaeological site. Well, we're recording it as a baseline anyway, but we're saying it's eligible for reasons A and B, right? Mm-hmm. Those reasons may not be the same in the southern part of the state or in another state. So a similar site, with the same or similar number of artifacts, types of artifacts and that sort of thing, may or may not be eligible in another state or another region or another area.
Yeah.
And it's not because we're not applying the eligibility criteria evenly. Mm-hmm. It's because of regional context. And that seems to be very, very difficult for a lot of field technicians to wrap their minds around, to wrap their head around. You know what I mean?
Let's step back on that just for a second here. Are you having field crews, especially field technicians, not just crew chiefs, but are you having them actually do eligibility in the field? Because a lot of companies will just have them describe the crap out of a site and then do the eligibility determination back in the office. You know what I mean?
Well, I need my field technicians to not necessarily evaluate the site, but evaluate the site as for eligibility, but to consider those things at each site that may be helpful in maybe the crew chiefs or the field directors or even myself to evaluate. So, for example, let's say this is not a based on a real situation here, but as a hypothetical. If you're going out to a site in Idaho and you're recording different features and you've got just tons and tons and tons of the same features over and over and over again, you're recording all those features, right? You're recording, let's say it's a little mining site. You're recording all the prospects, you're recording all the ash shafts, if there are any, adits, structures, things like that. I need to know what disturbances were at the sites. And we're not talking just activities, disturbance activities like the adit or the shaft themselves or the tailings piles, waste piles. We're talking about, has the site been bladed? Has the site, is there an access road? Like, why forget those things that might be overgrown? I need people to say, instead of just looking at the mining features, look at the other features that are around it. How did the mining crews access the site? There had to have been a road there.
Yeah. That sounds like fundamental site recording type stuff too. Like, I don't care what state I'm working in. I'm going to record that whether I'm looking at eligibility on the spot or not.
But in recording those things, and I'm using a really bad example here, but in recording those things, knowing whether or not that site had been bladed or knowing whether or not that site had been thinned at some point, like by the forest or what other effects to the site there may have been, does affect eligibility. And there are things that are being there that could be missed. The same things goes for lithic scatters that you're out looking at in the middle of the West Desert, or a lithic scatter that's going on and that you're digging in shovel tests in the middle of Mississippi or Arkansas or Tennessee. If you've got a road going through it, I need to know where the road is, the road fill. How far does the road fill go? Is there a fence on the site? Were there some structures? If so, like modern structures, if so, I need to know where those are. Those are all things that have potential to affect eligibility.
Yeah.
So even though they're not assessing the site for eligibility, they need to consider those things that may affect it.
Right. Well, like I said, that to me, that comes down to a training thing where it's like, hey, this might be controversial to you, Sonia, but I honestly don't even want them thinking about necessarily eligibility at the field technician level. I want them thinking about the site and everything on that site that needs to be recorded and understanding a little bit about why that stuff needs to be recorded. And then the crew chief or the field director or project manager or PI, whatever the company level is, can determine eligibility based on that. But letting them know, listen, every single thing out here needs to be recorded. If you're determined that the site is 50 years old or important in some other way, then record everything. Don't exclude something because you thought it needed to be excluded. So I don't know. Exactly. I think I stepped on Bill. Yeah.
And I don't necessarily disagree with that.
Yeah.
I guess I would ask who's doing the training, because if I think back on when I first started to record sites, it was from other crew chiefs or other folks who, they didn't always get all the information that I think that, I record now. So, from the very beginning, it started off as a situation where there was folks who had already learned a certain way, whatever those habits were, good or bad, and they were just kind of replicating those things. And then it was only through the situation of, recording an entire mining site and then not recording the road. And then you find out like, oh, wait a minute, that road's actually a feature too, and it connects to another mining site. So the question is this just one site? Are these two sites? That's when it starts to get into another complicated area. Well, I wouldn't have actually known any of that if I hadn't gotten on that pathway. But I was just doing what I was taught, from day one. Then later on, I start recording the roads. Or it's the same thing with like multi-component sites that have buildings and artifact scatters, and then features and other things. A lot of times I used to work for companies that would have features description sections, and it was only under having those feature description pages that you start realizing, oh, wait a minute, this open cut needs to be measured by this, by that, by how deep it is, by all these other things, because those are the things that are required on it. Or this building, you have to actually do an architectural form on it, and then at that point, that's when you start realizing that there's other things that you have to do. But if you're at a place where they don't really have those, it's difficult for you to know everything. So I guess my question is, who's doing the training? Because in my case, it was other field techs and other crew chiefs who were doing the training, not the person who was actually in charge of the project.
Oh, absolutely. 100%. And to take that a step further, when I got out of undergrad, I knew very little, precious little about eligibility. I think I took one class and it was discussed in passing. Even in grad school, when I got out of graduate school, I took a CRM archaeology class. I took 1 and 2, so 2 classes. And I had already done years of professional, professional research in the field. And I'm not even talking about school related stuff. I'm talking about like summer work during the school year. I didn't know a lot about eligibility. And I can't necessarily expect new field crew to understand that. But when I've got crew in the field that have 5, 10, 15 years of experience, surely there's some connection going on there. Like when you go out and you record a site, make sure you record all the features, not just 1 or 2 of a certain type of feature, but to also consider what has affected that site. What, okay, we've got a nice, 2-track, or not even a 2-track, a nice bladed road through that site. People still use it. Is that bladed road brand spanking new? And how often does it get bladed? Is it maintained?
Yeah.
I mean, that's an effect to the site. So I expect sort of discussion about that.
That's one thing I was going to mention is, even if it's you've got clearly a historic mining site, right? I mean, that's not really hard to tell, but you've got clearly a historic mining site. You can have a brand new bladed road that you watched them make yesterday go through that site, right? Go right through the edge of it.
Yeah.
But if it's through the boundary or next to it,
Absolutely.
or something like that, I mean, you still want to record that and call it a modern feature, but it has to be recorded as a disturbance. It's either directly impacting the site because they bladed right over the top of it, or it's going to provide better access to the site. And there could be future disturbance based on that.
Yeah. And the same goes for right-of-way fences along historic, or not even historical highways. If we're talking about a prehistoric site, when a right-of-way fence goes through, you've got 10 feet of disturbance right there. It's important to know where the edge of the road base goes to, and then where is that right-of-way fence, if there is one.
Right. I think that we can maybe have an eligibility clinic, right now on this episode. I don't think we were planning on that, but I think I'd like to get your guys' thoughts on some of the stuff like that, because let's back up a second and talk about this, because what we're talking about when we say eligibility, in case you're new in this field, which is fine, it's May as you're listening to this, so we might have some new graduates that heard about this podcast and are now listening to it, and maybe this is the first episode you're listening to. If so, welcome to the field. You'll be in it about 3 years, and then you'll be working at the Gap. So anyway, the eligibility is eligibility for listing on the National Register of Historic Places. Okay. I mean, that's what it is. And there's 4 criteria that help determine eligibility. And like Sonia was saying earlier, when you're talking about context and context helping determine eligibility, let's say, for example, you're working out here in Nevada and you find a silver mining site near Virginia City that has maybe it was recorded 30 years ago and eligibility was never determined. It was left undetermined. People did that a lot back in the 80s, by the way, and 70s here in Nevada. They just left sites unevaluated. In fact, I've got a project I'm waiting for the snow to clear out on Elko. The only reason I'm going out there is because the sites were left unevaluated, and now the mine needs them evaluated. And so I got to go back out, re-record it, and then evaluate the site. And re-recording a historic site, that's not that big a deal. Most of the stuff is probably still there, probably still visible. But do you know how many unevaluated small prehistoric lithic scatters that simply have disappeared off the landscape now?
They're so hard to find.
They're so hard to find, and they have me go out when the vegetation is super thick, and I tell them that. The BLM knows that, but nobody cares because it's like a 10-flake lithic scatter. Vegetation's grown up, and there's cracks in the sediment all the time, as the freeze-thaw cycle hits in the Great Basin. And then, flakes fall down into those cracks. Other flakes are revealed as sediment is washed off the top of them. I mean, it's just the sites are very fluid. And one year to the next, you may see a site or not see a site in the same exact space.
My personal favorite is the NAD 27 and NAD 83 conversion.
Oh, Jesus. Yeah. I mean, your site could be off 200 meters.
You younger folk who are just learning archaeology now and going out into the field.
Yeah.
You're mostly in NAD 83. Mostly, unless you're in Mississippi.
Yeah.
And they like to do things in NAD 27 and NAD 83, so be aware of that. But just tracking down the site between NAD 27 and NAD 83 is a huge mess.
Well, and they didn't always write what, in fact, most of the time on these old site records I've seen in Nevada, they never wrote down what map datum they were using. They might write down the topographic map they were on, and then you can go to that map and see what that was written in. But it's pretty obvious if the site was recorded before 1983, listen up, folks, it's NAD 27 because NAD 83 didn't exist. The 83 stands for 1983.
Yep.
So
and the feds didn't start using NAD 83 as a standard until 2002, 2003?
I don't know, something like that. But when we're talking about eligibility and context, I want to go back to this mining example. So you find this old silver mine that maybe was recorded, and you're trying to determine, okay, it was unevaluated. Is this eligible for listing on the National Register of Historic Places? Well, to be honest, from a data standpoint, probably not, because we have 1,000 silver mines in that area, right? So from an architecture standpoint, probably not. They all look the same. From an important event standpoint, probably not. They were all dug around the same time, and they all happened during the same event. From an important person standpoint, maybe. That's when you got to do your research and find out, well, who owned this mine? Was it a future governor of Nevada? Was it a future, somebody, that owned this mine? Did some important event actually take place there besides the actual mine? Something like that. And that's not the kind of thing field techs are even going to know in the field. But when you read, if field techs are actually given a historic context, and when I was a field tech, I never knew what the contexts were for the area unless you go look them up yourself. And sometimes SHPOs have them on their websites. Sometimes they don't. But if you knew in that area there were never any silver mines discovered, they were all gold mines, that silver mine's automatically going to be eligible because it's a unique thing in that area. And the context says it's all gold mines, it's all copper mines, and there's no silver mines ever. You're never going to find one. Oh, crap, I found a silver mine. Okay, that's probably going to be eligible because it's the only example of that in this area. Same thing with prehistoric stuff. If you find 25 million Elko corner notch, well, the next one you find is probably not going to be by itself without anything else eligible on a site. But if you found the only Elko corner notch for 1,000 miles, well, that's probably going to be eligible because it's unique from a data potential standpoint and other things. So, Doug, let's go to break real quick and pick your comment up on the other side because I know we're going to be digging into that. Back in a second. Hey everyone, Chris Webster here with the Archaeology Podcast Network. And if you like what you're hearing, considering becoming a member and supporting us, go over to archpodnet.com/members and support us at the supporting member level, standard member, or professional member. You can do $5, $10, or $20 a month, and you can do those yearly at $42, $84, or $168 per year. Again, that's archpodnet.com/members for more information. Get early downloads, show stickers, and a whole bunch of other swag. Hey, Chris Webster here to talk about advertising on the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you're hearing this, then you can advertise in the Archaeology Podcast Network. We are now with a new platform, so it makes it easy for you to track your own results. Head on over to archpodnet.com/ads to find out our prices and what shows are available for advertising. All our current shows are available for advertising, and if you don't see it there, it'll be up soon. So check out archpodnet.com/ads for all your advertising. If you're hearing this, then you know it works. All right, welcome back to the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 163. And we are talking about eligibility. I didn't know we were going to start talking about that, but we're talking about eligibility. And Sonia, it is a good topic. It's one of those things that kind of gets into a little more high level. I also want to say high-level philosophy about archaeology in the site and almost bringing a little theory into it. But what a lot of field technicians don't realize, especially newer ones, and maybe even ones who have been doing this a while because, I'll get into because why in a second, but what they don't realize is the reasons why we're out there. They say, we tell them, hey, tell us anything that you see, and if it's over 50 years old, we're going to record it. And that's generally all they know. And historics and prehistorics, maybe they have a high knowledge of cans or, projectile points or debitage or something like that. And that's all we do. But they don't really understand the why. And maybe they're told the why is, hey, there's a power line coming through here, or a mine is doing exploratory, drilling or something like that. But that's also not really the why. The why of finding and recording stuff is tied to the National Register of Historic Places. And we're doing this because this other thing is happening, but that's not what our goal is out there. Our goal is to determine eligibility on these sites and determine how, quote, important they are to the archaeological record. Now, that's also a subjective statement depending on who you're talking to and which Native American monitors you have out there. But
yes, that's true.
Yeah. But Sonia, you were mentioning over the break integrity considerations. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So, okay, here's the deal. I'm going to use yours for mine. So we've got the four evaluation criteria, right? We've got association. Mm-hmm. We've got big people. So we got A, association, B, big people, C, cute buildings, and D is data, right? We're just going to use the basics. Tom King right there for you.
Yeah.
Okay. So we've got this really important silver mine that is in a vast ocean of gold mines. It's the only silver mine out there. Yay, that's great news. Should that make it automatically eligible?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Maybe.
But now we have to go and take it a step further. And this is where I start getting nitpicky with my crews. We have to look at the aspects of integrity. There are 7 of those. And they're not something that a lot of people think about when they're out there, which is why I ask for a little more detail. So what are the 7 aspects of integrity? Location, setting, design, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association. Mm-hmm. They all have their own different meanings. So if we don't have any integrity at the site, so if it's missing all of those or the vast majority of those or the important aspects of those as it relates to silver mines, that one lone silver mine in that vast sea of gold mines may actually not be eligible.
Right.
And that's where I start twitching a little bit because I need to know. I mean, obviously it's location. We know where that's at. Does it feel like it did back in, the 1930s when it was first opened? Mm-hmm. Maybe or not. I mean, is this one little silver mine surrounded by a big residential area? That takes away from the feeling a little bit, right? Mm-hmm. Is the setting the same? Is the design of this little mine the same? It's still got association, but is that what is really going to play a big part in evaluating its eligibility?
Right.
To make it significant. So that's why I ask my crews to pay close attention to what is going on around you while you're in the field. What are you seeing? A plus B does not always equal C, right? In all areas. Mm-hmm. One site, that silver mine, might be eligible in that area, but not in another area. That exact same feature in a different area may not be the same because it's missing its aspects of integrity.
Yeah.
So these things all play into one another, and they are all things that, as field technicians and crew chiefs and field directors, that we need to think about. And we also need to make sure people are describing things the way they need to be described. Like if I hear something like, "Oh, we've already recorded, 1,500 prospects on this project," I didn't worry about taking photos or measurements of that prospect or the next 1,500 prospects. Then all of a sudden we're missing data, right? What I need is information. I need the information. So when I go through as the person who does quality control over the project, and I say, okay, I'm seeing this photo here, and this has a lot of disturbance. Why wasn't that disturbance discussed in the notes? Or what are the aspects of integrity? What does the integrity tell you about the site? Why do you say it is actually eligible? Maybe one of the buildings is run down. Can you demote a site's eligibility? Basically take it from eligible to not eligible? And why do you want to do that? Describe it to me, explain it. And And like we were talking about before, I don't expect my field technicians to be able to or to even make those recommendations. But I want you to. I want you to think about them because it makes you a better archaeologist as you get more experience and move forward with your careers. It also puts you a step ahead of other field technicians. If I see your notes, and I'm not saying you, Chris, but I'm talking to the general field technician out there. If I look at one set of notes, if I look at one set of notes and it says, you know what, I noticed that there was a newly bladed road and the site had these disturbances on it. Looks like a little bit of looting here. Somebody totally trashed the boarding house or whatever, you know. I look at it and I go, 2 thumbs up. Yay, that's great news. Explain that to me. Tell me what that is. But if I see another one that says, you know, 3 prospects, 1 adit, and I get nothing else, then we start going, I start going, well, how do you know that was an adit? Tell me why you thought something that was 20 feet long and 5 feet wide and 3 feet deep was an adit. Yeah. Explain that to me.
Well, you know, from a peer training standpoint too, you know, and teaching people how to look at stuff. One of the challenges we have, and Sonia, you know, you and I uniquely deal with these things, especially here in the Desert West, is our field projects are always hours and hours and hours away from where we live, right? So from that standpoint, when you get your data back at the end of a 10-day or even the end of a project, for that matter, if it's a short enough project, you know, it's really difficult to send someone back out to do this further recording because you noticed something was missing or something wasn't described adequately enough. And again, I'm not going to do a commercial for WildNote or anything here, but any sort of digital recording that you can do in the field will help start to train people into doing these things, because if they're able to upload information to you, hell, even if they just want to scan pictures of their notes, I mean, I don't care, whatever form of digital archaeology you have, if you're reporting back daily your information to your supervisors and they can look at that before you come back from the field, you know, you might have to drive the opposite direction you were planning on going that morning to head back out to a site, but at least you're not driving 5 hours round trip to go there and back and something like that. So if you can manage to get your information off to your supervisors daily, well, then they can evaluate what you're looking at and say, hey, I need you to head back out there real quick and write a few more notes about this thing that I saw in one of the pictures, or show me where that's in your notes because I can't find it, and tell them why, you know. So let's move on to Stephen. You had your hand up earlier. Do you still have a question on this? Is it still applicable?
Vaguely. My basic thought was when Sonia was describing things like integrity and whatnot, is that a lot of times archaeologists fall under the misconception that integrity means like physical integrity. And it does, but it doesn't just mean physical integrity. It means historical integrity. Like it actually says historical integrity in the criteria. And it's a really big deal that you could have a field that has been essentially disked to trash, and it could still be eligible.
Agreed, totally.
You know, like if that field, if the events of that happened in that field, you know, like still has a certain level of association and historical integrity, like the surrounding vegetation hasn't changed or anything like that, then you could be looking at something that's still eligible.
Now look at historic battlefields,
that
for example.
None of the artifacts are in situ. Exactly. And that's a very important notion. The weird thing is, though, like, because if you ever have to deal with buildings people, is that their notions of integrity seem to be like way more precise. Like they don't like any change, and it's like, what do you mean they put, you know, artificial siding on it or something like that? And it's like, well, yeah, but the building's still there. It's still in the same configuration. You know, like this is still the building where these things happened. But the fact that the facade's changed and now it's like,
or the fenestration, or
you know, like all of a sudden, like, oh, well, that's a deal breaker.
Because those are aspects of integrity.
Yeah. But if it's still, if it's an important association that, like, you know, for archaeology, it's like we can be like, well, you know, it's slightly modified, and like we could be dealing with, you know, again, a battlefield or a farmstead where all the farm buildings are gone, but the site could still be eligible. But changing the siding on a building, like, I mean, theoretically, we're all looking at the same thing, right? Like, we're dealing with places.
I mean, we're also looking at how extreme did they go. If we found George Washington's birthplace, the house he was born in, and that house has been completely changed, but the studs are still there, and the foundation is still there, does that actually make it eligible because of its association with George Washington? Does the house become eligible, or does that place become eligible?
I mean, it's the National Register of Historic Places, so it has to be the place.
Yeah, but it also depends on if we try to nominate it under a landscape. So, we could also make it, landscapes fall into that whole district type thing. So some of the things could end up being objects, even if they've been wasted, instead of actual archaeological remains or sites.
Mm-hmm.
And then the buildings can also be architectural. So then it ends up being a multi-component site that's recommended, and you treat it like it's a landscape to describe all those different things in the historicity, the intangible aspects too. So the intangible aspects of the events.
We also start looking at contributing versus non-contributing elements to an archaeological site or landscape. So, for example, up in Wyoming, you can have this huge prehistoric landscape. It's a bunch of lithic scatters. We already know that those are out there. What they need to know is where are the loci and whether or not those loci are contributing to the eligibility of the landscape itself.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? So there may be aspects of, say, I don't know, Ben Franklin's place, or, some of the guys back east, the important, historical folk back east. There may be aspects of their property that are no longer contributing to the eligibility of the site, but they are still eligible overall as part of the site.
Mm-hmm.
Now we're getting into all the philosophical parts of archaeology and the in-depth stuff that as field technicians become crew chiefs and field directors and project managers, we all have to learn and consider. And that's why it's so important that our field technicians gather the data that we need to make those arguments later on.
Yeah, this is just a question for Stephen. How does it work in Canada?
Nothing's eligible in Canada. We don't want Canada on any registers.
Ouch.
Well,
I imagine they must have something equivalent.
Well, this is funny because Doug should know. He's from Canada. You've worked in Canada, right?
No, I have not. No.
Oh, you haven't?
I've worked like Southwest, Belize, Scotland, places like that, but not.
I mean, Scotland's basically Canada, though, right?
Yeah, pretty much. Well, actually, it's the other way around.
Part of it's on the same
That's right.
tectonic plate or whatever. So half of Scotland is on the North American, whatever tectonic plate. I'm pretty sure it's not called tectonic plate, but you know what I mean. It's
right.
Yeah. So like
what?
Oh my gosh!
The geologist in me has to look this up
Scotland
now.
is the birthplace of geology because, like, you guys know Loch Ness. Like half of Loch Ness has completely different geology than the other half. Like it's split down the middle because it's where the plates are. So you get a very deep lock because it's basically plates separating. So like the northern western part, it kind of goes at a diagonal. So the northwest part of Scotland is a completely different geology, and it's part of the North American. I want to say tectonic plate, but maybe there's a different. This tells you how much I know about the geology, other than it's like North America, but it's pretty much on the same plate. So like Canada and parts of Scotland all share the same geology.
Yeah. Well, but still.
Huh.
Yes.
So it's basically the monster that holds them together. Is that how that works?
Nice. So Stephen. So tell us when and how Canada just did copy and paste from the National Register from the United States and the NPS guidelines.
Well, they didn't.
We didn't.
Some countries in Africa have also done that, by the way, just as a heads up.
Have they?
Well, Canada still didn't. So too bad.
Too bad.
No, that's a kind of a tough thing to answer because it is provincially based, and there is not the overarching legislation the way there is in the U.S. So, you're talking about. So, I think Sonia was talking about how her crews were working in different states, and the rules kind of changed. I can't remember if that was during the recording or before.
Yeah, that was Sonia.
It's kind of like that because the rules are all provincially based rules, and so like the prairie provinces tend to be kind of pretty much the same, but you get into Ontario and it's a little bit different, and BC is a whole different world, and so it's I don't know that there's necessarily one like an easy way to answer this question, and I definitely don't know too far outside of the provinces where I've held permits, which is Saskatchewan and Alberta. I will say that for the most part, the way that we were talking about sites that were unevaluated, that is something that's that's what actually to me one of the major differences. In that here we go find the sites in the survey, and then when you do that low level excavation, that 5% sample or whatever, you just put in a bunch of 1x1s or 1x2s or whatever. That's actually considered to be on the mitigation level. So here you go find the site, and then you talk about is the project going to avoid it or not, or does it is it going to impact it? And at which point they don't get the act approvals that they need to proceed with their development until like they address that somehow, and they can
Sure.
go to mitigation, or they can like avoid it, but like avoidance like has to be like it can't just be like okay we'll avoid it. They have to like has to show up in the plans, like this is a environmental reserve, or this is like here are a new set of plans where this isn't a lot for the housing development, or we rerouted the pipeline, or avoidance stuff like that. But it has to show up in the plans.
Sure.
And as far as criteria goes, I don't know that there's like the set of like rules that the U.S. deals with. There are for buildings and for evaluating historic properties as for things that end up on the provincial register. There is a provincial register, so if it's a registered property. But I can't think of what we do, as generic archaeology. More often than not, it really does seem to be we go out and it's like, well, we found a site. We're going to recommend initial mitigation, stage 1 mitigation for, say, 10 meters of excavation. And then from there, you make a decision whether to go to stage 2, which is, what you would consider to be like phase 3 or like a large mitigation.
Right.
If it is, and the reason I'm kind of fuzzy on this is because I haven't actually found a site that went to stage 1. I've had a few where I recommended, but then like it's almost always a project you design. I think that I've never really heard Canadian archaeologists sit around and talk about things like eligibility the way that we're doing now. And so I would look, if any of my colleagues are listening, yeah, and this is different, by all means, corner me and tell me, because I would love to know.
Yeah. Well, on that note, I think we're going to take our final break, and then we'll come back on the other side and wrap up this discussion about eligibility and integrity and things like that, and see how we can help start improving this process. Back in a second.
Prescription products require completion of an online medication consultation with an independent healthcare provider through the LifeMD platform and are only available if prescribed. Subscription required. Individual results may vary. Additional restrictions apply at lifemd.com. Read all warnings before using GLP-1s. Side effects may include a risk of thyroid C-cell tumors. Do not use GLP-1s if you or your family have a history of thyroid cancer.
If you've struggled for years to lose weight and have given up hope, did you know you can now access GLP-1 prescription medications through LifeMD? LifeMD is now offering eligible patients online access to GLP-1s, the breakthrough prescription medication that can help you lose body fat and weight. Listen to what people are saying.
Probably the easiest thing I've ever done. The medication comes in the mail and it's very easy to use. I've been able to live my normal lifestyle and I've lost 20 pounds already and I've never felt better. It changed my life.
And here's the best part. Your insurance may cover 100% of the cost of your medication. So go to trylifemd.com to have your eligibility checked right now. Get started today at trylifemd.com. That's trylifemd.com.
To the teachers, assistants, and support staff who see potential in every child, Grand Canyon University recognizes you. We created the National Center for Teacher Preparation at GCU, along with a generous scholarship, so you can become a licensed teacher with paid benefits. Over 100 GCU alumni have been recognized award recipients, including Superintendent, Administrator, and Teacher of the Year. Find your purpose at Grand Canyon University. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu/parapro.
Hey, everybody. If you're listening to this podcast, you're interested in education, you're interested in archaeology, and we got something that combines both. Head on over to patreon.com/Team Black, and you'll see the Team Black Patreon page. We have lots of areas and ways that you can support us, anywhere from $1 a month at a team supporter, all the way up to $25 a month at Team Black Master. At each one of these tiers, you get videos that were produced by Team Black, videos that were produced by other experts in the field. We've got everything from rock art to getting a job in cultural resource management to field tech basics to, COSO rock art. I mean, all kinds of different things. And check it all out. We're always adding new videos, and you can join for 1 month, watch everything, and then cancel if you want. But we're looking for people who want to support us. They want this education. They want to watch these videos on their own time and learn something in the process. So patreon.com/Team Black. That's patreon.com/Team Black. All right, welcome back to the final segment of the CRM Archaeology Podcast, episode 163. And I think we've determined that this podcast is eligible as a great discussion about eligibility. So I know that was a terrible joke, Bill, but let's take this. Bill, you're a professor at the University of California at Berkeley. Hey, come on, Doug. Come on.
That was bad, man.
We all have great integrity, and this podcast is now eligible. So I'm just going to put that out there.
Was Doug booing Berkeley? I think he started booing.
He might have been booing Berkeley.
Started talking about Berkeley.
Well, that kind of happens, right? Some people are haters. It's all right.
Well, okay, it was a 2-for-1. I was actually booing Chris, but yeah, I'll take Berkeley on that as well.
I still like the guy anyway.
All right, Bill, as a professor teaching archaeology and teaching, shaping these young minds for the world, how do you think we should be teaching this stuff? What's the program? Yeah,
this goes back to my statement before about not knowing what I was doing when I first got dropped in the water.
Right.
So
none of us did.
Yeah, we all get dropped in, and as we've been talking about, it's not really absolutely clear. The National Register criteria, they were designed for communities to be able to record and preserve their own heritage. And so as such, they're not specific. There is not, a 2,000 long list of all the different kinds of site, pre-colonialism, lithic scatter, pre-colonialism, pit housed village. Like, they didn't make all those kind of things. It was kind of left up to the people who live there, and then also the archaeologists in the future. So the entire thing ends up changing throughout time, but we're still stuck with the same rubric, right? It's really flexible. That makes it one of the things that's, difficult to teach. And what I try to, teach folks, assuming that they'll actually use their education to help their life. Like, I assume if you've made it to my class, you really, in fact, want to do anthropology, or you really need this for your, pre-med degree. And if you're in the class, you're going to learn something that's actually going to help you for the future. And so this is the kind of stuff that I would teach to an archaeology class. And, I'm trying to grapple with how would I do that? I mean, one thing that I can imagine is a series of case studies where once folks knows the law, then they can try to apply all those criteria in class exercises, right? I can also see another situation where we, go out to sites and then folks try to record all these things. and, give them instructions on here's all the kind of things that we're supposed to record because these are all the things that matter for this entire complex. And then, after we've recorded them all with, paper, tablet, whatever you want to do, have us go back to the class and try to fill out one of these, try to write a site description. I mean, I think that those two things right there would help a lot. But other than, people getting hands-on training, I'm not sure how you could teach this in a class. Hopefully you guys have some suggestions.
I remember being in undergrad in Advanced Methods in Theory and Anthropology, which was kind of the class that we started learning about all the laws. And what I remember the most about that class is that everybody's eyes were glazed over at the high level readings that we had to do that, it went over stuff from Franz Boas to, Lou Binford to law. It covered, a lot of things. But what I remember the most about that is we had a hard time making connections from one thing to the other. We're learning about early anthropology and the law and the Antiquities Act and making that connection and how the law changed as we moved into post-processualism and into modern archaeology. Okay. So that class was not easy for most of us because we were having a hard time making those connections. And it's not the way that the instructor did it. He did just fine. And, shout out to Ron Root on that. Great job. But at the same time, when I moved into grad school, I had to take CRM archaeology twice. I took number 1 and number 2. So the first one was learning about all the laws, and the second one was more applied, right? Even then, people were still having a hard time understanding why the National Historic Preservation Act was relevant to what they were doing in the field, because these were field archaeologists that were being trained. They're not theoretical folk. They weren't folk that were planning to go immediately out and get jobs as agency archaeologists. They were training to be field technicians, field archaeologists. And those of us who took the class might have had a little bit of a step forward, but at the same time, we still didn't understand. Yeah, when you go out into the field, you're actually going out for reasons A, B, and C in compliance with the NHPA and NEPA. So, we've got the NEPA umbrella, National Environmental Policy Act. Then we've got the NHPA, National Historic Preservation Act. And then we've got the Antiquities Act. And we've got all these other little things that kind of play and feed into one another. And which agencies apply to which. It's so confusing.
Not to mention that the eligibility criteria actually come from the National Park Service.
Yeah.
So,
exactly. And where are all these things coming from? Making those connections was very, very difficult. And the only way to learn them was basically to have a baptism by fire. I remember working, this was probably 15 years ago. I had to submit my first report. I started with a new company as a program director, and I had my first report for peer review to the environmental manager. And she looked at me and she said, "Sonia, absolutely not. We will not submit this to the client because our job is not to make recommendations that puts us in a legal bind for liability." And I said, absolutely not. That's not what our job is. Our job is to go out, identify the resource, and make a recommendation to the agency. That is what archaeology is. Field archaeology, CRM archaeology. We, as CRM archaeologists, our job is to go out and record what we see. So record what we're observing in the field and make a recommendation. That's the goal, the basic goal of field archaeology. CRM archaeology is probably a better way to put that. So how do we... It's to identify and evaluate and make that recommendation. We don't make a determination. That's done at the agency level. All we do is make a recommendation. So we need to properly record in the field in order to make a valid and substantiated recommendation to our clients and the agencies. And we're not teaching that to our students. Would you agree with that, Bill?
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And I just shared a link to a blog post I wrote, I think last year or something like that, that discussed which courses helped me in my career. And the ones that helped me were the ones that were simulations of real world stuff that I would actually encounter in the future, or ones that had more of a hands-on, aspect, like biology or anatomy and physiology, where you have to do the lab, you have to dissect animals or, body parts or learn these different things, even though I don't talk about frog, anatomy anymore. I remember a lot more because of that kind of stuff.
Going back to what Sonia was talking about, I think that part of where you should be getting this, at least on the theoretical level, is the CRM class that you're taking, or reading Tom King's books, or whatever. And I and we've argued about this in depth in previous episodes, but that is the theoretical assumptions. Those are the assumptions that we have to make in order to do our job. Like our job is goal oriented, and it's based on the assumptions of basically the legal frameworks. Like if those legal frameworks were different, we would be doing our jobs differently. And then I think that's the initial way that it's taught. Is you have your CRM class, and you sit down and you read Tom King's books, and you discuss about examples and stuff like that. But then beyond that, some of this turns into, no one class can give you all, every permutation of example, right? Like there's a lot of different property types. There's a lot of different historic contexts. There's a lot of different state level legal frameworks, and you're dealing with different agencies, and they want different things. And there's a lot of this. And it really some of it comes down to is you have to go out and you get experience. And as a field tech, you're working with field director or supervisor, whatever, principal investigator, and you're helping to record these sites to make, determinations and recommendations. And it, that should be part of the discussion. Like while you're working, it's like, well, is this eligible? Is this not eligible? Should it be eligible? Why? And that's part of the experience. And you start to see a lot of different site types and opinions and reasons, and it informs the way that you will eventually start applying those criteria when you're the one making that call. And I don't think that that's ever a completed road. Like, we're still kind of debating about things, talking about it on this episode. And I think that, even as a professional, once you're making determinations and recommendations, it's still an ongoing dialogue process. You're talking to your coworkers, you're talking to your bosses, you're talking to your clients, you're talking to the agencies. You're talking it over with the SHPO. Like, do I get concurrence? Do I not get concurrence? If not, why? How's this different? And so I don't necessarily see it as a singular education thing. Although I think that it is, very important that you have that initial course load, I guess. You take that course, or if your school didn't offer one, you're sitting down and reading Tom King stuff. But then, you have to continue that by applying that in a variety of situations. And that's why experience is necessary. And that's why, you don't necessarily want to send out field techs and only field techs to look at sites.
One of the things that I've thought about in terms of the best way to educate students so that they're prepared. One, they're never going to be prepared. And Bill, you mentioned in the text here that, you're not a huge fan of baptism by fire. Unfortunately, it's always going to be there. That's the best way for us to learn sometimes, is to get into a bind and figure out how to get out of it, or be exposed to a different type of resource and learn how to identify and document it. It doesn't always have to be a negative experience, but the best way to prepare for it is to take those classes in college that are applied, That's why I took 2 CRM archaeology classes in grad school. The first was predominantly, not completely, but predominantly the theory part of it, meaning the law and everything. And then the second part was applied. I want you to learn how to build a budget. I want you to apply this when you go out. What is it that you see when you see these things? What types of sites? Going out and looking at things, taking field schools. Those things are all helpful in becoming a professional later. And unfortunately, many states only allow one applied archaeology program. There are a few states that allow multiples. Some are other private universities. But right now, I personally feel that universities are so focused on theory and history, because it's archaeology program, that we're forgetting that 80% of these people are going to go out into the field and do CRM archaeology. So we love and we relish in our history and how our profession has developed, but we're forgetting that these people that we're putting into the field need to learn what they're going to be doing when they get out there. So that's where we struggle when we have field technicians who even, have 5 or 10 years of experience, don't know how to properly identify, or maybe not even identify, but just record an archaeological site. And, how we folk who have like 20 plus years of experience doing all of this and managing all of those problems that we get coming out of the field, we need to be able to educate and start that education in college. And then we need to give applied education in the field in order to move forward and have people better prepared. That's my 2 cents. And I'm hoping that one of these days we'll get to see that more in a lot of the universities.
I'm going to disagree a little bit in that I think that the theory and history is an important aspect of why we're doing what we're doing.
But too much of it
at the university
level.
Too
much of it. If we're emphasizing Lou Binford and Franz Boas and all these other guys, are we really moving forward, or are we just sitting in the back?
You learn that from a good one, though. Someone who actually takes the time to explain that, right?
I think it's essential to know why you're doing what you're doing. Why are we digging 10 centimeter levels? Why dig in arbitrary levels at all? And it's like that. You learn that in your theory class.
Mm-hmm.
Like you understand all your methods are coming from the theory of old guys from years ago. And
yeah, but if you're taking like 5 classes on anthropology theory, I mean, that starts at the very beginning in one of the very first almost anthropology 101 classes. And we have an entire major grounded in anthropology theory and not enough of it saying, hey, 80% of you guys are going to go into CRM. So let's talk about applied and why theory applies to CRM.
All right, guys, we're going to have to cut it off right there. I think we could probably lead this discussion into another episode, to be honest. So let's think about that.
Yay!
And I know. And hey, if you're listening to this, especially if you're new, whatever level you're at, if you disagreed with us, if you agreed with us, doesn't matter. Check out our contact information. You can contact any one of the hosts via our page on the website, which is at arcpodnet.com/CRM podcast. If you want to look at this episode specifically, it's /63 after 163 after that. But otherwise, all of our episodes have the Twitter handles and things like that. You can always get me, Chris, at archaeologypodcastnetwork.com as well. So check all that out. Send in your comments. I want to know how we did. What do you think about this? Do you teach archaeology? Do you teach an applied program? How do you do that? Maybe we can get you on the show if you're down for that. So anyway, thanks, everybody, and thanks for listening to this. And next time, again, we might be continuing this. We might be talking about something else. But send in those comments and send in those emails. I just want to know your guys' general thoughts on this. And we may read your email on the air. We'll leave your name off of it, of course, if you don't want us to. But I want to get more stuff like that in so we can have this more heavier engagement with our audience. All right? We'll be back in 2 weeks with another great episode. That's it for another episode of the CRM Archaeology Podcast. Links to some of the items mentioned on the show are in the show notes for this podcast, which can be found at www.archpodnet.com/CRMArchPodcast. Please comment and share anywhere you see the show. If you'd like us to answer a question in a future episode, email us. Use the contact form on the website, or just email chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Support the show and the network at archpodnet.com/members. Get some swag and extra content while you're there. Send us show suggestions and interview suggestions. We want this to be a resource for field technicians everywhere, and we want to know what you want to know about. Thanks to everyone for joining me this week. Thanks also to the listeners for tuning in, and we'll see you in the field. Goodbye, Doug.
Bye.
See ya.
I'm not Doug, though.
You know, we did it for him last time. Steven was Doug last time. I haven't heard from Steven yet.
Oh, Steven's on the bandwagon?
He's pulling a Doug. You know, I'm just going to shut this off at 30 seconds. I'm like killing this.
Come on, guys.
Who's gonna win, Doug or Steven?
I will give it to Steven. Goodbye, everyone.
Yay!
Nice.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Oh, man.
Doug.
Oh, shit. Here we go. This show is produced and recorded by the Archaeology Podcast Network, Chris Webster and Tristan Boyle, in Reno, Nevada, at the Reno Collective.
This has been a presentation of the Archaeology Podcast Network. Visit us on the web for show notes and other podcasts at www.archpodnet.com. Contact us at chris@archaeologypodcastnetwork.com. Thanks again for listening to this episode and for supporting the Archaeology Podcast Network. If you want these shows to keep going, consider becoming a member for just $7.99 US a month. That's cheaper than a venti quad eggnog latte. Go to archpodnet.com/members for more info.